Hello everyone, welcome to part 10 of this series. In this episode we are going to set up a basic human AI. This character will not be a friendly and he will engage in combat. I want to mention here that this behavior will not be entirely complete, as we will cover damage and health properly in the following combat tutorial that will address this for both the AI and player. Before we start, I would like to thank all of my Patreon supporters for the amazing support. This scene will be made available on Patreon. So we're going to set up a basic character. I'm going to put him at a small distance just to make sure we're not interacting with him straight away. So let's get started. So I'm going to create an empty here. I'm going to rename this to characters. Why not? Let's group that together with props, items, etc. And let's put some other things away as well, just a bit of management. So let's call this nature and drag these items in there. There we go. Now I'm going to drag the horse into characters as well, but I'm going to leave the player out as it's something that we just need to access so often. It's just annoying to have it in a subfolder basically. So let's create a new character. There we go. And I'm going to rename him to enemy basic 01. Now the reason for 01 is ultimately I want to have a couple of variations that basically just work exactly the same, just have a different look. So now we need to find our guy. There we go. Yeah, well, 0 is not going to work. I'll just put him down. There we go. So he needs to have a look, obviously. And in my last video on character customization, I used the Modular Fantasy POLYGON Fantasy Heroes Modular Pack, something like that. I'll link it in the description. But basically I'm going to use that for the enemies as well. As there's one thing I always hate in games, if certain enemies have really cool looking loot I can't use myself. So in order to avoid that, I'm just going to use the same prefab that uses all of the elements that are used in the modular characters. That way we'll avoid that issue of ever happening. So I'm going to use one of the presets, as that's quite easy and I don't have to figure out myself what to look. I'm going to use preset 4. There we go. And let's drag him in. But I am going to cheat a bit. I'm going to turn off his cape. Reason for that is because the way our sword is aligned by default, and that's something this character will have as well, it would basically clash with the cape. Wouldn't cause an issue, just cause clipping. And that's something I want to look at in optimization later on in the series, but for now I just prefer avoiding that. So just turn off his cape and that's it. Other than that, he's done. Looks like I don't know, he looks like he could be an enemy. Let's just call it that. So just like with the create a customization series, if you want to have a different look for his hair, etc., just put a different material on it. So you can still customize a bit how he looks even if you use a preset. So keep that in mind. Now that we've done that, I'm going to collapse all of that and we're going to create a couple of empty action sets. Another one. And conditions. Now these will all be tied to his inventory, to his behavior at some point. but let's just properly name them. So combat, patrol, and life and death. I think it's a pretty decent name that for, you know, the part that will actually decide his health. And we're actually going to use one more. Let's just drag it in here as well. And this will be search. There we go. Now we're not even going to set all of this up. As I mentioned in the intro, some of the things are going to be set up in the combat video, simply because we'll be doing a lot of the same for both player and characters. The whole life death conditions will actually just be copies of each other. They won't be that much different. They'll rely on a couple of list variables, of course, but in essence it will be quite similar for both player and characters, and it just fits better with an actual combat tutorial. So we'll have them here just, you know, as a preview, but we're not going to use everything straight away. So what we need to do next is create a behavior. So I have a folder just for behavior graphs, and we're going to create a new one. Game creator, behavior, and let's call this enemy basic 01. As you can see, I already made it before, obviously. And the wolf you can see in here is a quick preview as well. We're also going to set up animal AIs in the next video, as I think that's, you know, going to be pretty cool. And it won't just be, you know, it's an animal. His behavior will be slightly different as well, as not just the player will be an enemy to him, but also characters like this, for example. So that'll be pretty cool to set up. For now, let's open this up. And what we're going to do here is we're going to group everything in 3 categories. So let's create a root. Task, no, it needs a composite first. Sorry about that. 1 task, 2, and 3. So let's sort this. And the importance here with all of this is, I'll explain what everything does as well. Every behavior tree just needs an entry point. That's just the root. Can't do anything without it. Then the entry point leads to the selector, and the selector is going to basically prioritize your tasks. So 1 will have the highest priority, lower, and the lowest, basically. So if you have 6, keep that in mind, that the selector will choose priorities here. So if you want this last one to happen by default, you either need to make sure your conditions are right, or otherwise these will always supersede what happens here. So quite important to keep that in mind. Now in my case, this will actually be the one that's going to be used by default, but that's all based on conditions. There we go. So allowed to complete, allowed to complete, and allowed to complete. And the conditions we're going to set up are based on senses. So we are using the behavior graph, of course, for this, the behavior module, which has perception and behavior. So as you can see, senses have a couple of options. So we have can see, which you can set to can see and cannot see. So I'm going to copy this over, paste it here, and this is the situation where he can't see. Now in the middle, we're going to have something that we're not going to entirely set up, as it is based on the life and death that I mentioned, but we are going to start the basics. So this will be based on stats, attribute value, invoker, so the one using it, which is going to be the character in this case, and it will based on its health. Now the default stat for health is 0.25, so keep that in mind. That's what we set up in the health and HUD tutorial, if I'm correct about the naming. And that will be the case for him as well. So the moment his health drops, he's going to perform a set of actions. Now when it comes to the priorities, it is important that that supersedes this, which will basically be patrol. So we can actually give these names: patrol, search, and combat. Perfect. So the order of this is by default he will be patrolling. So the condition here is he can't see the player and he'll patrol. This will supersede patrol in the case where he lost health. Now this doesn't necessarily mean he's actually seen the player, so that's why this is a separate task. Because if you shoot an arrow from a distance, you want him to react to that action, but you don't want him to automatically just start tracking the player, because maybe he hasn't seen the player, so wouldn't make sense for him to automatically track. So that's why we're calling this search. He'll perform a search action. And this one is if he's actually seen the player. Now this needs to supersede everything else, because you don't want him to patrol if he's seen the player. You don't want him to search for the player if he's already seen him either. So that's why this order is quite important. Now we're going to set up a couple of actions, not that much actually, as a lot of the real actions are going to be outside of the behavior tree. It's just a lot easier to manage, and as you cannot duplicate behavior trees for the moment, it's a lot simpler to just duplicate actions that fall outside of the behavior tree. But we do need to set up a couple of basic things, just because this is going to dictate the order in which events happen. So first thing is going to be a change property. If he's patrolling, I don't want him to run. Now, reason for that is that by default, game creator characters are always running, if you remember that from the default setup. Even though the speed might not give that impression, they're actually not walking, they always are in a running state. So I'm going to turn that off. While he's patrolling, he shouldn't be running, that's just weird. So he's just going to be walking. If he sees us, I do want him to run, because, you know, he's going to be in combat, so it would be a bit strange if he's just casually strolling along. And the same if he is hurt, I do want him to run for this as well. Now, while we're here, let's just add a weight, 0.1, and then we're going to execute actions. Now these actions will be his patrolling actions. So we're going to set variable, local variable on the invoker, and that's going to be search, and we want this to finish. Now the reason wait to finish here is important. If you don't do this and you don't have a restart in one of these actions, it will just go back constantly to these set of actions. So we don't want that to happen, so that's why this is here. So let's copy these over to here as well. And we can even copy this over, we'll just change the naming. And there we go. Now we are going to add a couple of things to the other ones, but it was just easy to set this up. Patrol. So what we want to happen here is by default, we want him to carry a sword on his back. We don't want him to unsheath his weapon straight away, because he's patrolling. There's no reason for him to be alarmed. So we are going to equip sword, equip item, there we go. Equip item, invoker, and that's going to be the sword we set up for the player as well. It's a cool sword. Why, you know, not only our player should have it. If you want a different item, of course, just, you know, create a different item. And let's drag this up, and that's it. So that's all that's going to happen. So this will, because this is the first action that happens, he'll always have this on his back. So quite important. When he sees us and when he goes into combat, we want him to draw his weapon. So draw weapon, invoker, and it's going to just be the same sword here in this case. So we have that. Then if you remember from the animation video, if you didn't follow that and you don't have equipped drawing animations, you can actually skip this. But if you did follow that video, then we'll actually need to remove that item from his spine. So it was in character. Yeah, character attachment. There we go. We need to remove the item from his spine, which is the sword. And there was a small weight to match our animations, which was 0.3. There we go. And basically this matches our animations. So yeah, pretty nice. I'm going to drag this weight 0.1 to here, just to have this order. And I'm going to add one more thing, which we're not going to use straight away, but it will be quite useful. So if we go to Game Creator Preferences, just create a new global variable, which is a bool. So, just press new, name it player scene or something else, use a bool, everything, and that's it. So we're going to do that straight away, even though we're not going to use it yet. That's already something we want to use in combat. So let's go to variable and variable bool. I don't want this to be a toggle, as I want to make sure that if he sees us, it's going to be in an active state. Always in an active state. So it shouldn't be a toggle for that single reason. So there we have it. So this is what we're setting up. Now in the search, we're actually going to do a lot of the same. So let's just copy that over. So he's going to draw his sword. He's going to weight 0.3. I'm going to remove it from his spine as well. And yeah, that's pretty much exactly the same actually. The only difference is that we're not assigning this bool, so the player scene, because, well, that's not the case here. But I do want him, and that's a personal preference, you don't even have to do that, but I actually prefer him to do all of this if he's seen us. So yeah. Anyway, let's continue. So I'm going to save this. And now we're going to set up some basic combat actions. So when it comes to the combat actions, you can get creative. I just have something pretty simple, which works pretty well. Actually quite happy with it. So we have a weight, follow, so invoker, follow player. You can change these distances, so minimum radius, maximum radius, so from how far he is from the player. Then he's going to block, invoker, start blocking, wait 2 seconds. Now the reason for the wait 2 seconds when he starts blocking is, he's going to be prepared. He's not just going to attack you like a maniac, so he'll be a bit defensive, wait a bit, and then he'll attack himself as well. I'm just going to copy this over, then turn off blocking, so stop blocking, and we're going to do a melee, input melee attack, invoker, and always make sure you really change the invoker, the character, because by default it will be player, and that will basically mean that this set of actions would control the player, which could be fun at times, but not in this case. We're going to add a weight of 0.5 and copy, no, that's the wrong copy, and yeah, we have 3 of them. I think that's enough. I think the default combo is 3 as well, so that's actually pretty decent. Then we're going to have him wait 1 second. Now this wait 1 second is basically going to be the opening. If you want the opening to be smaller, just reduce this time or completely remove it if you don't want there to be an opening. And then we have a restart. Now it's actually quite a little important detail. I know there's a lot of weights in here, but this one is actually one of the most important ones. Because if you don't have this one, you only really be able to attack him with a counter attack. So, you know, block the right time, parry, and attack. If you have this for a really long time, he'll just, you know, stand there for a long time and you'll easily be able to kill him. I think 1 second is fine for a basic enemy. Maybe 2 would be even better, I'm not really sure. But this at least will give a window of opportunity to normally attack this character instead of only be able to do that while parrying. So I think that's fine, but yeah, important little details, so keep that in mind, play around with this, see what works best for you. Same goes for the first weight. This does give a window of opportunity, so definitely play around with this if you're not happy with the amount of time this takes. Now, I'm not going to set up the search function yet. I know that's doesn't really seem combat related, but everything it does is combat related, so it's based on damage and health, so we're going to skip that for now, but I want to create it just so we can already drag it into the behavior graph. We are going to set up patrol though. Now for patrol, again, I'm just going to go with something basic. This is something you can experiment with and, you know, get creative. So we have a move character, invoker to a marker. I know we didn't set them up yet. We're going to do that in a bit. And yeah, I'm just going to copy these over. So that's second marker, third marker, first marker, second marker, third, and the fourth one. And after the fourth one, we're going to restart these actions. And we'll, you know, be back to where we originally started. So this is for a 4 marker, including where the character is standing right now. And yeah, he'll just basically go full circle. So if you want to make that more complex, if you want him to actually do something at each marker, you know, check his watch if you have an animation for that. Just, you know, add a change state. It's not that hard. We're going to add a create empty here, and this will be our patrol area. Now, you don't normally need to put this in a different parent, but I'm going to explain why I'm doing this as well. So we're going to add our markers here. Let me actually rename this to just marker. And let's make sure gizmos are on. Going to put this a bit higher as well for our terrain. Maybe it should even be higher, I'm not really sure. This is fine. And then let's just duplicate it. So we have 4 markers and we're going to drag that into our patrol. So 1, that's the one he starts. No, the one he starts at should actually be lost, because that's where we're returning to. There we go. And then the last one is going to be our starting marker. Perfect. Now let's drag these a bit around. Here's fine. Here is fine. Now keep in mind that the rotation of the marker actually decides how the character rotates while he gets there as well. So important little detail. And yeah, something like this. So we have our markers. Now that's our HUD getting in the way. Now the important thing with these markers here is where you actually end up placing them in your hierarchy. So if they are part of your patrol area, like here, then they will actually move with the player, which can create nice dynamic patrolling. It won't be as fixed, and in a big open world that could actually be quite interesting. But there's some downsides to it as well. The other approach has some advantages and some downsides as well. So I'm just going to demonstrate it, as that will be quite a bit easier to explain what I actually mean with this. So in order to make sure this all works, we need to add a couple of components to the character. So behavior, which is our enemy basic 1. Now as you can see, we didn't set up the parameters yet, so we need to make sure we do that as well. We have perception. Now with perception, we have his field of view, we have our vision distance, and we have what he can see. Now by default I'm just going to leave this to everything. However, the vision distance in my opinion is just way too big. It might be realistic, but in a game it's just not fun. So I'm going to reduce this to 20, which might be a bit short. But you know, that's up to you. You can play around with this and see what works best for you. Just keep in mind that even if you are going for a realistic type of game in terms of look, it can actually be quite annoying if his vision distance is really big. You won't be able to hide much, or I don't know. I'm not a big fan of that. Field of view, it's a hard one. I'm just going to go with 70, which is pretty much the field of view of the default camera as well, I think, which would basically give him a similar field of view as we have ourselves as a player. So I think that's pretty fair. And obviously we need our melee character melee as well, as he's using melee, and we need player or equipment. I'm not sure if it's equipment. Yeah, it's equipment. He needs equipment as well. So that's because he's actually using the sword on his back that is from the actual inventory module. So despite him not using an inventory module, he is using part of the inventory system. So that's why it's quite important that he has this on as well. Now this is something Game Creator will just automatically attach if you go into play mode, but I'm pretty sure that won't properly work if you were building this project. So keep that in mind, just it's good to have it on there. Now, considering we forgot to set up our parameters, let's actually start doing that. I'm only going to set up the first two, so combat and patrol, as we didn't actually really create anything for search yet. So there we go. Make sure you press enter afterwards, otherwise it won't actually register after typing. Save, and then we are going to drag those in. So we have combat and we have patrol. I think of it, I'm pretty sure I actually forgot something here. So when it comes to combat, there's one important detail that we're actually forgetting, and that's him actually targeting our player. I forgot about that. So targeting is a system, so focus target is a system introduced with the melee module. So if you haven't really used the melee module before, that would explain why. So let's add our player. So it's not as complex as, for example, the combat module does when it comes to targeting system, but it is actually quite decent for at least our enemies to use, as it will really focus them on our player. Now, for our player, we are going to use the combat module when we get there, simply because it's a lot more elaborate and a lot more flexible. But when it comes to enemy AIs, this is actually pretty good, and I'd consider good enough. So we're going to drag that here just before our 0.1 second wait for execution. And yeah, that will allow him to really focus on our player instead of just randomly walking around and just hitting the air, basically. Cool. So that's set up. That's pretty decent. I think we all have it. So I'm going to go into play mode. I'm not actually going to play. I'm just going to stay in scene, just so you can actually see what I meant with our patrol areas. Quite important. So let's go into our scene mode. And as you can see right now, because we have gizmos turned on, the markers are actually moving with him. Now he is still basically walking to that initial spot of the moment the action triggered, which is pretty cool. And as you can see right now, his patrol area will actually become a lot bigger like this, and it will be a lot more dynamic as he's actually really walking around the world, which is pretty cool. So that's a big upside to this, that you won't always find him in the exact same spot. It looks a lot more dynamic without actually having to do much, because we're only setting up 4 markers. But at some point he'll, well, basically wanders, further and further. And yeah, I think it's pretty cool. But there's obviously a downside to this as well, as it's harder to control where they are walking, and if you have an area where they're only supposed to be, then this won't properly work either. So I mean, it could work, but you have to just make sure your nav meshes, everything is correct. So that's approach 1. Approach 2 would actually be creating another empty and call it enemy 01, for example. Going to drag that up. Going to drag our enemy in there, and then we're going to drag out a patrol area and actually drag it here. So now it will be part of this parent instead of the character itself, meaning it won't move along with the character. So if we hit play mode now, and we go into a scene, you will see that the markers don't move with the character, which gives you more control. So he'll, obviously he'll always walk this area. The downside of this obviously is that, well, it's quite frankly, it's going to be a bit more boring in the sense that he'll always patrol the same area. Now, this is obviously something you do see a lot in published games, that they'll always patrol similar areas, as it is a lot easier to just control their behavior and be 100% sure they're not doing anything they're not supposed to do. So you'll most likely run into a lot less bugs. So yeah, it's up to you what you use. I'm just going to keep it like this, as this does give me more control of what he's doing. But obviously there are some downsides to it as well in terms of dynamicness, if that's a decent explanation. So there we have it in terms of patrolling. Now there's one little detail I do want to show, and it's actually going to be quite important. Right now our world is pretty empty, and we just have a bit of grass, we have our trees, and that's pretty much it. Now, the moment you start introducing more objects into the world, especially if you do it dynamically with, for example, map magic, he could hit roadblocks. Now, in order to make sure that it still properly works, we have to make sure that Navmesh is on. So what we're going to do on our character, we're going to turn on can use navigation mesh. Now, yeah, let's save that as well. I'm not really sure why, but sure. Now there's one thing we need to do in order to make sure he can use navigation mesh, which is obviously creating a nav mesh. So let's go to Window, AI, Navigation, and we need to select our object. So in our new folder we have map magic and we have our terrain. That's what we're going to bake. So I'm going to go to Object, Navigation Static, and this should be walkable. And then when we press bake, it is going to create the nav mesh for this entire area. Now you can always clear this, so this doesn't have to be something definitive. So if you still want to add a lot more trees or stuff like that, other objects, rocks, villages, that's all fine. This is not a definitive thing. You can just, clear it and then just bake it again afterwards. So let's hit bake. So our nav mesh is created. Now, as you can see, it's pretty decent. It actually covers our entire terrain, but it did exclude our tree objects, which is pretty nice. So we don't have to create offsets for that. By default, the trees and the rocks will be excluded. Now, as you can see, there might be some details you need to change here when it comes to our nav mesh, so not everything will be done exactly properly, but yeah, pretty much. But yeah, you can change those little details if you want to. Now, the reason, for example, this might not even be excluded, it does recognize it, as you can see, but maybe these points just don't really stick out of the terrain that much and wouldn't actually cause for much of an elevation on the player side, which is why the trees are properly done, as they are really high and stick out. So this stone, for example, just to explain a bit, it really does not stick out of the ground that much, just a bit, and easily something, he can just walk over. And when it comes to this side actually sticks out quite a bit. The other side doesn't, as you can see. So he could walk on this and just, So yeah, just be mindful of those little details, but generally speaking, default works pretty well. Obviously, you can tweak a bit of settings here, make it work better to your preference, but that's completely up to you. So I'm okay with this for now anyway, so we're going to just hit inspector again. It will hide the nav mesh, it's still going to be there, but now we can be sure that even if we have more objects in the world, or this tree would have been in the way, he would actually walk around it instead of walking against it. So yeah, pretty decent. Now let's look him up. Well, there he is. Let me also be prepared and actually grab my sword myself. There we go. Now he can see us right now, which is cool. And yeah, we didn't set up blocking yet, or impacts, or anything to really happen if he hits us. But as you can see, he does target us pretty well. Now if I jump away a bit, you'll see that he'll properly follow, he'll properly focus. Now we haven't set up combat yet, we just have this default melee hit and nothing happens. As you can see, for combat we'll need to do something with our hitboxes, we'll need to do something with our camera as well, as the camera definitely does not work like this by default. It doesn't work properly, but as you can see, at least, you know, our character is pretty decent. He behaves decently, blocks, attacks, gives a little space here, so 1 second, and then goes back into blocking. Make sure he stays close to us, and yeah, it's actually, for the limited amount of actions we set up, he behaves pretty well. So once we properly set up combat, this will actually be pretty cool. So that was it for this video. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please hit like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.